Welcome. In this video, we will continue our unit on early imperialism, and we'll have an introduction to the 5 case studies of the rest of the unit. So this small chart gives you the 5 regions that we're going to study. It will go over the relative strength of these areas as of 1500, 1492. I then have a description of what happens in first wave imperialism with kind of a catchphrase that helps you to remember some of the distinctive elements, and then an update what happens next semester as we look at second wave imperialism in the 1800s. Okay, we're going to start with India, and India's government strength was relatively weak. They had a very decentralized system, and I'm going to draw the analogy that India actually had a fair amount in common with the Holy Roman Empire, which had a weak central government. In first wave imperialism, they engaged in trade with Europeans. Due to the decentralized nature of the government, big chunks of India are given away to Europeans, and a sort of phrase that helps that be memorable is forts and ports, which were that the Europeans demanded to trade and occupied a heavy presence along the coast of India, building forts and occupying ports, but having relatively little impact on most of India. In second wave imperialism, the British tended to dominate most of India. So we'll look at that in second wave next semester. In China, China had a strong central government, and China believed their people to be at the center of the world. And when the Europeans showed up, the Chinese wanted little to do with them. And due to the strength of their government, the relative strength of their military and economy, they barely traded only when they wanted to. And when they did, they demanded that the Europeans kowtow and really, do certain criteria in order to even trade with the Chinese. In second wave, China was not truly conquered, but major ports were, and the Chinese, we'll talk a little bit next semester about the Opium Wars and some of the difficulties China encountered in later centuries. In Japan, they had a feudal system and they had a weak central government, but shortly after imperialism, the central government sort of coalesced around the Tokugawa shogunate, and then they closed the door. So there was some trade with Japan, but then primarily they closed the door and rarely traded with Europeans because they didn't want to. In the second wave of imperialism, Japan will adopt the "if you can't beat them, join them" mentality, and they actually imitate Europeans and become the dominant imperialist power in Asia. In Africa, well, that's a whole continent, not just a country. We'll look at a couple in a couple different areas, but it's very diverse. There were strong countries and weak countries. It was a diverse place, much like Europe or any other continent, full of kings and rulers and strong countries and weaker countries. And really, there was a lot of trade between Europe and Africa. The most unique and distinctive feature, and the one that has the biggest impact on how and why the world is the way it is today, is the social and cultural impact of the African slave trade. And so that will be a focus this unit. In second wave, many of, really all of the countries except Ethiopia, really virtually except for Ethiopia in Africa, were conquered in second wave imperialism by European imperialists in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And finally, the Americas. Again, a diverse region. There's Incas, there's Aztecs, there's dozens, maybe many dozens of other tribes. And they, in first wave, they're totally conquered. Remember, in this period, and from all the centuries beforehand, there was nothing special about Europe. There's nothing special in the water or the blood. They're not richer. They're not more advanced. There's nothing all that unique, technologically or power-wise about the Europeans until after this globalization period, where Europe does begin to concentrate a fair amount of wealth and world trade and naval power into its own hands, into the hands of certain nations in Europe. So why is it that the Americas are conquered? It's disease. It's the Native Americans are laid low, and we'll talk about that by the end of the unit, possibly tomorrow, for how and why that impact happened. And second wave, not all the Americas practice imperialism, but at least the United States, somewhat in that second wave, did practice some imperialism such as in the Spanish-American War and Hawaii and things like that. Okay, first of our case studies is India. Prior to European contact, you had a weak central government. I draw the analogy that it is much like the Holy Roman Empire. They had suffered many invasions. They had, fought wars against Arabs and Persians and Turks and the Mongols. And against the Europeans, they're going to have a major home field disadvantage. They are divided among their various, not quite city states, but small Indian states. And the Europeans are able to play one off against the other. They can land at one port, negotiate with the people in command there, and if they sign a deal, they might help them against a neighboring state and sort of gang up against them. And if they land somewhere and they can't make a deal, they'll go to their enemies and make a deal with them and counterattack the original. And so they sort of have this, again, home field disadvantage, does India. At the time, they were actually the Mughal Empire, an area that the Mongols had conquered during the 1500s. And this meant that the dominant religion in India, of course, was Hinduism, but most of the rulers were actually Muslims. And so, as we just saw the religious violence in Europe and in the Holy Roman Empire last unit, we might also think of this similarly, that there was this religious conflict between rulers and the ruled, and that this further kind of alienated some of the rulers from the suffering of their own people, because they didn't mind making a deal as long as Europeans would play ball with them. And so these various princes or maharajas of India would make various deals with the Europeans because they were in competition with each other. So these Indian princes or maharajas did not have one strong central government with which they could reject European influence. Rather, they kind of all competed against each other and were vulnerable to the Europeans. So post-European contact, you had Vasco da Gama, who came as early as 1498 and was initially welcomed. He came on several other voyages, and famously, both he and Pedro de Cabral got into conflict at Calicut, where I believe they had a port factory that was attacked by resentful people in the area of Calicut, and the Europeans, the Portuguese, retaliated by just bombarding the city, by parking these warships off the coast and opening cannon fire on the city, hitting houses, schools, all just in general, the civilian people of Calicut were the target. And this was the retaliation if someone refused to play ball, such as in some places they would pay tribute. They would just sort of pay them money almost to go away, or give them a favorable trade deal just to kind of stay on their good side, because they would show no qualms about parking a fleet off the coast of a city and just shooting cannons at the city in order to intimidate them or pressure them or get what they wanted, and basically kill a number of civilians. And this is what happened with Pedro de Cabral, who was the Portuguese who left Portugal kind of trying to imitate Columbus, but he actually hit Brazil. And so that is one reason why in Brazil they speak Portuguese. Portugal had claimed and colonized Brazil at the same time Spain was colonizing and conquering Mexico and other parts of the Americas. And ultimately, these Rajas competed with one another, and a big chunk of the Indian coast is given way to the Europeans. You can kind of see this string of coast up and down ports up and down India, where there are European settlements in order to trade on favorable terms, where they would hire Indian workers to work in these port factories in order to more effectively facilitate the export of the desired goods. Now, while it is a little bit lopsided, and while it is establishing this pattern of trade and globalism, it is a pattern of trade. They largely don't conquer India. They have these ports through which they funnel a lot of India's trade and exercise a degree of control over that, but not over all of India. Next, we can talk about China. China, before European contact, had the powerful Ming Dynasty, which eventually fell and gave way to the Qing Dynasty. An interesting aspect of China about 100 years before Columbus was the Admiral Zheng He and his similar to Columbus exploration, but just of a different part of the world. Zheng He took several voyages, much as Columbus did. They were much larger, with a much larger entourage of ships. And while they didn't cross the entire open ocean, they went halfway around the world and back a number of times. The difference being, whereas the Europeans were very eager to get stuff from far edges of the world, China had a very different attitude. The Chinese considered themselves the middle kingdom. They were like the center of the world. And as they encountered all kinds of other peoples, they realized there was, quote, nothing we need. Now, of course, there are still poor and peasants in China, and that was most of the people, as it was throughout the world. Most of the people were poor peasant farmers all over the world at this time. But the upper and middle class in China believed there was nothing they needed, that all the great stuff was made in China, and that they were basically giving away technology secrets, as they had with the printing press and gunpowder and other things that originated in China, but were seen as these huge innovations in Europe. The Chinese thought they had all the good things of the world, and that anytime they would trade with other people, it would just make them worse. And so rather than, when they launched this major exploration campaign, they settled into isolation and said, yep, we've explored the rest of the world and it sucks. Therefore, we need to limit our exposure to all these foreigners because they're just going to make us worse, which is the exact opposite the Europeans had, which was to be really impressed with all this stuff and really try to get things from other parts of the world and develop that global trading empire. And so they isolated. So post-European contact, Europe really wanted the Chinese goods, and the Chinese don't. They want cold, hard cash, gold, silver, what have you. And they have all these rules. You can only trade at certain tribute ports. You have to bribe by paying tribute to the Chinese. And you famously have to kowtow, this series of ritualistic high and low, deep, deep bows in order to beg the permission to trade with the Chinese. And it's one of those, like, well, you can see who wears the pants in this relationship. That was what the Chinese demanded. And not all would put up with it. The British very famously wouldn't, and the Dutch would. And so, there was a price to be paid for that. But the legacy of trade during this period between the Europeans and the Chinese is that really the Chinese are able to set the terms of trade. Now, the downside for them, the legacy is that other countries, most notably the British, are very eager to find something that they can trade with China. Unfortunately for the Chinese, they will find that one thing eventually, and it will be opium, the core ingredient in heroin and other hard drugs. And the British will, in the 1700s, largely try to move a lot of opium into China in order to secure the export of Chinese goods that they desired. That concludes our introduction to those first two case studies. We will conclude the rest of them and get started on the Americas next time. Thanks for watching.